While working at the Rand Corporation in 1967, Daniel Ellsberg became a consultant to the White House and Defense Department on matters concerning the Vietnam War, giving him access to classified and top-secret documents. He photocopied a 7,000-page study that later became known as the Pentagon Papers, and in 1971 he gave those documents to the New York Times. Coming up next, part one of a two-part interview with Daniel Ellsberg. He talks about his motivations in leaking the Pentagon Papers, as well as his opinions on the Vietnam War. The Richard Nixon Presidential Library conducted this interview as part of a project to document the 37th President's administration. This portion is about an hour 20 minutes.
Right from the beginning and until late in 71 when they came out, so for 77, 2 years, a couple of years, I always thought for the Pentagon Papers to have any effect, they should be the basis for congressional hearings, precisely because I knew they didn't tell the whole story or an adequate story. I knew a lot of what was excluded from them. And what you needed was oral testimony, preferably under oath, of people who really knew the decision-making at the time and could explain what was the implications of these papers were. The documents themselves didn't tell the whole story. I knew that very well. For example, they gave a very misleading impression of what John McNaughton ever thought, my boss, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. When he wrote anything down, it was a briefing paper for McNamara to use to argue with other people, to present McNamara's preferred policy. It didn't usually express what McNaughton thought was appropriate policy or what he thought to expect or considerations. He was writing lawyers' briefs for McNamara to present. That was just one example. But I knew that in many other cases, it didn't answer many of the questions. So what you wanted was testimony in light, and to keep people honest and to jog their memories, you needed to be able to show them, read these documents and tell us now why you wrote this or what is not said in this document, and so forth. So I always wanted congressional hearings, and I had the mistaken belief then that Congress was more likely to hold those hearings if they had the documents in the first instance and were not scooped by the press, that they could present, dramatic material. In retrospect, 40 years later, that's not the way Congress works. In the end, it was very important that they appear in the newspapers. Congress reacts to what the public is concerned with. And if you don't have a public concern, they don't investigate and they don't press things. And Neil Sheehan later, in urging me not to give it to a congressman first, but to let the Times do it, which I was skeptical about. I thought, well, they just want a Pulitzer Prize, or I didn't really think that was the way to do it. But he was right. The Times had a greater potential for getting those hearings done than simply giving the documents to Congress in the first place. I was wrong about that. I might note, the Times didn't do it either. The hearings never took place. Both Fulbright and Mansfield, when the Pentagon Papers came out, said, we must hold public hearings on this subject. They both said that publicly right away. They were in charge. No hearings happened. Why? And Nixon wanted them. And they didn't happen. They both understood each other. The hearings would mainly have incriminated the Democrats. And Fulbright and Mansfield and the other Democrats had no interest in pulling McNamara in front and confronting him with lies that he'd made to the public and mistakes that he'd made and that the Democrats had made. So the Democrats held no hearings, even when there was public interest in the thing. Nixon, on the other hand, was very anxious. He, on the tapes, is always saying, we can't wait to get McNamara answering these questions. It'll drive him crazy and so forth. Didn't happen because the Democrats were in control. If the Republicans had controlled Congress, there would have been hearings. And I would have been happy with that. I wanted the truth out. But in short, both in 71 and 69, what I believe Hubert Humphrey said, I keep forgetting whether it was Humphrey or Walt Rostow, one or the other, both speaking to Haldeman and Haig and to Nixon's people about the Pentagon Papers, one of them made the comment, "No good Democrat could have released these." Now, I was a Democrat, and I am a Democrat, but I wasn't a good Democrat, nor am I now, I must say. I'm kind of a self-hating Democrat at the moment. But in '69, I wasn't a good Democrat. I was prepared to see the Democrats get the blame, which they richly deserved. I didn't want to punish them or do anything. But in terms of ending the war, I thought it will only happen if the Democrats accept the blame that is rightfully theirs early on, before Nixon has planted his flag on this war, quickly. And as I say, the Democrats I talked to were good Democrats, and they rejected that idea. And if I'd given them the Pentagon, they would not have wanted to put out the Pentagon Papers. And so, in answer to your question, my thought on the Pentagon Papers was this, that if they are the basis for hearings before Fulbright, they may, and Fulbright's initial reaction was very favorable to put them out till he thought better of it. But at first he promised me that he would put them out. And my thought was that if he gets them out in time, then Nixon will perceive that he has the option of blaming this war on democratic deception, democratic incompetence, democratic lily-liveredness, or what, from his point of view, whatever, and say, all right, the war is hopeless, I have to get out. My mistake was to imagine that Nixon would have picked up that opportunity. Mansfield did give him that opportunity privately, and Nixon rejected it. He was determined not to get out. On the other hand, Fulbright, it turned out, was much more, when he thought about it, when he saw what the Pentagon Papers were, could see that there were real dangers in it for the Democrats.
Now, Dan, you tried this in the fall of 1969. It didn't.
So I gave them to the Senate.
But you don't. What do you do for the next 2 years? Because nothing. You don't get. What you want is
yes.
What you wanted to have happen doesn't happen. In fact, what you'd feared would happen does happen.
Yeah. Now, here's where my mistake about Nixon's policy had an effect. Had I realized that as I was copying the Pentagon Papers, Nixon was directing the duck hook planning and military planning in connection with his November ultimatum, and in other words, that the war had the potential for exploding very quickly, even that very fall, or perhaps later, a little later, I would have felt more urgent about what I was doing. And there's a number of what-ifs that might have gone into that. As it was, I didn't know about Duck Hook because he didn't carry it out. And the reason he did not carry out the escalation was, I believe strongly, because 2 million people walked in the streets and were in demonstrations on October 15th, 1969, the October moratorium effort. And another demonstration was scheduled for November 15th, and again was extremely large. And that led him to give up his escalation planning because he knew that there would be perhaps 10 times as many people out if he escalated. So it was not the right time for that. I didn't know any of that at the time. The reason I didn't know was that Mort Halperin had been kept in the dark on that, working for Kissinger. It was what I was talking about earlier about compartmentation. Halperin had been identified by Kissinger as somebody who was working for him, but who thought we ought to get out in the interests of the country and of Nixon, who he was working for. He wasn't sabotaging anything. He just believed we should get out. Therefore, he wasn't told. And people he was working closely next to him, Tony Lake, Roger Morris, others, didn't tell him any of that, even though they were working side by side, essentially. And then Halperin left for related reasons in late August, early September. I believe if he'd stayed in the White House even a couple more months, he probably would have learned of the planning that was going on. And if he'd told me, I would have made every effort to get at that planning and release it, with some hope of doing it. I knew all the people. I was trusted by them. I'd worked with them on NISM 1 and earlier. And if I'd had the duck hook planning or the November ultimatum, I would not have copied the Pentagon Papers. That was only history. It ended in '68. I knew from the beginning that it didn't show what Nixon's planning was and had only a small chance of affecting Nixon policy. I described what I thought the chance was. But if I'd had documents or information on his current planning, I would have put that out. 10 pages of that or 30 pages would have been worth more than 7,000 pages of history of the Democrats. I copied the Pentagon Papers only because it was all I had. It was the best I had, and I hoped that people would see that a history that showed 4 presidents in a row, to some extent as early as FDR, but then Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. You could say 5 presidents. Had all planned escalation or involvement in Vietnam, different from what they'd told the public. Made secret threats, secret operations with costs much higher than they ever admitted to the public, and with prospects much dimmer, much less promising than they ever admitted to the public. All of them had done that as a pattern. Perhaps the public could believe what I was told by Halpern, that another president, the latest president, was doing the same. That's what my hope was with the Pentagon Papers. It didn't happen. My hopes there were not fulfilled. The public was impressed by how much lying had gone on by all these earlier presidents. They still wanted to believe that our current president was telling the truth, that there was a new Nixon, that he was getting out, which was after all very plausible. How could he not want to get out? In '68 and '69, everyone gave him the benefit of the doubt on that because it was hard to imagine a sane person wanting to do anything else other than get out, if he wasn't burdened with it like Humphrey or Johnson, but if he was a new person coming in. Now, so the Pentagon Papers did not, I think, really reveal to them what Nixon's, or even make them very inquisitive about what Nixon's real policy was. At the time, and for a generation later, Nixon's policy has been summed up by nearly everyone, journalists, academics, public. He was trying to get us out as fast as he could. And that was an extremely misleading description, although not entirely false. He was trying to get U.S. troops out, but not by allowing the communists to achieve any kind of success, except to control the parts of the country they were already controlling, but not to control Saigon, not to have a coalition government. Nixon, as I understand it, and did in '69, never intended for Saigon to become Ho Chi Minh City while he was in office, that is, through '76. If ever, he hoped to leave his successor, Republican or Democrat, with a strategy that could be persisted, that could be prolonged, with enough will. And I think had a good basis. It turned out he had a good basis for doing that. He hoped even more to make it easily sustainable, a cheap, sustainable war, because the North Vietnamese troops would not be there anymore.
Dan, let me ask you, tell us about 1970. What effect did Kent State have on you? What effect did the escalation into Cambodia have on your sense of urgency?
There I thought that did have a big effect, because it told me the escalation is happening sooner than I expected. Let me go back now to '69. I did not foresee it happening in '69, where we came very close, as close as 2 million people. If the moratorium had not occurred, I believe we would have escalated and probably used nuclear weapons in the fall of '69. Nixon had plans done for nuclear attacks, as Marjorie Morris informed me, a mile and a half from the Chinese border, in a relatively unpopulated area. I won't go into all the details here. The intention was actually to kill very few civilians, but to send a very large signal, quote, to the Chinese and to the North Vietnamese. So I think he wanted to use nuclear weapons, and actually an aide to Haig, who was later chief of staff, told Cy Hirsch that Haig was amazed that '69 had ended without the nuclear weapons being used. Robert Ellsworth, later a NATO ambassador under Nixon, was also amazed that there had been no use of nuclear weapons by the end of '69. But that was because of the moratorium. I didn't know that. I thought escalation was likely to occur. Nixon didn't, and Kissinger didn't. They thought their threats would succeed. I thought their threats would not succeed, and therefore there would be escalation eventually. The North would launch an offensive. So I thought the escalation would come when the North launched an offensive, which I thought was pretty sure to happen no later than '72. Probably not 1970, a little more likely '71, probably not till '72. But they probably, just as Tet was intended to affect our election in '68, probably '72 was a good year, maybe '71. So there would not be an escalation till then. And so there was kind of a year coming where there would where things would go on as they were, a stalemate at a relatively low level. And so when you say when Nixon didn't, when my hearings didn't take place in '69, I sort of gave up on the Pentagon papers being very important. I continued to copy them for a while and give them to Fulbright until I'd given them all. I thought he should have them all for his, maybe he would eventually use them. But I didn't feel a great sense of urgency. And weeks would go by when I didn't copy, and then something would come up and I would copy some more. Then Cambodia happened. And that said to me, wait a minute, he's prepared to escalate. Actually, what I interpreted that was still part of a threat. He wants to make clear that if they have an offensive, he will blow North Vietnam to pieces. What he really was trying to make clear was what the threat he'd made in '69. If you don't get the northern troops out, I'll blow you to pieces. But in either case, I saw it as a demonstration that would lead to further escalation. It would not be effective, in my opinion, and I was right about that. The North Vietnamese did not ever concede what he was asking. So at that point, I did become quite urgent, and Fulbright's people told me, Norville Jones, that they would hold hearings now, and I began looking at the papers and saying, here's the witnesses you should call. I worked in the Foreign Relations Committee offices for a while, trying to prepare for hearings. And actually, unfortunately, the pressure, instead of going for a McGovern-Hatfield type bill of getting all the troops out of Indochina, the political strategy by the Democrats was to press the Church-Cooper bill to get them out of Cambodia only. And Nixon did agree to that and did get them out of Cambodia. And the air went out of the large movement that responded to Kent State. I think the war could have been ended in April, May of 1970 if 200,000 people, I think, in Washington then for demonstrations after Kent State had closed down Washington. It was the one time, this is a what if that I think is some interest. Congress was for once furious at the executive because they felt they'd been totally misled by the escalation in Cambodia. They hadn't been briefed on it. I think the one person that's come out that they briefed was Ford, the person they expected to forget what he'd been told, or at any rate would not tell anybody, and he didn't tell anyone. So Congress felt totally blindsided on that. They were very angry. And I think if people had shut down Washington, which you could do with 200,000 people, Congress for once would not have been against the anti-war movement. They would have been sympathetic. And what you could have gotten, possibly, no guarantee, but there was a chance of cutting off funds for continuing the war. What finally happened, this is 1970, what finally happened 3 years later in 1973, when they cut off funds for combat operations in Indochina instead of just in Cambodia. I think that could have been done. If I look back at what I could have done then, it would have been a good time to put out the Pentagon Papers, to make an all-out push. The war was illegitimate in the beginning. Look at the papers of 45, 46, 47, 48. That's what made the greatest impression on me. But it was history that never did get published too much. Nobody read it very much. And what influenced me really never got to the public. The fact that we had begun the war in support of a French imperial reconquest, of a colony that had declared its independence. That meant from American values and American anti-imperialist ideals, it had no legitimacy from the beginning. It was not clearly illegal, by the way, I found, because the UN Charter does allow for colonies and even, for internal policing. And it wasn't clearly illegal for France to continue to claim ownership of Indochina, even though they'd declared independence. But from the point of view of American policy, and what FDR was secretly agreeing to do, let the French back in, and Harry Truman did do, and Eisenhower did do, all of these had to be very much obscured from the American people because sustaining the French Empire was not part of American ideals. Or to me, so it was illegitimate from the beginning. To me, that meant, in '69, when I read these documents, that it was unjustified homicide, which I saw as murder. Not just an error, not just a bad, incompetent policy. It was mass murder. To be killing people who wanted to be independent in order to sustain an imperial control of them, whether it was the French or ours. I didn't think we had any more legitimate right to run Vietnam than the Japanese or the Chinese for 1,000 years before them, or the French. And we had no more prospect of doing it.
Dan, you mean when you went to Vietnam in the 60s, but in
I
the
had
60s,
a different perception in 64, 65.
But everyone knew that Indochina was a French colony. I mean, that wasn't a secret.
As a historian, how old are you, by the way?
46. 46.
So you have to be in your 50s to remember, I found, even the Pentagon Papers. And I think, I'm going to make a generalization, obviously it doesn't apply to you because I don't personally. I think historians, it's very hard for historians to get a feel for what people's understanding was at the time, how they saw things at the time. You can get it from newspapers to some extent. The public was almost entirely ignorant of the U.S. role in sustaining the French from 45 to 54. So they didn't think of it as a U.S.-French war. All Vietnamese saw that war not as a French war, which is what all Americans saw it as, but as a French-U.S. war. In fact, I talked to a Viet Minh, a man who later worked for Diem, Tran Ngoc Chau, still alive. He'd be very interesting to interview, and he's in your area, by the way. Or rather, he's in the Southern California area. He was at that time a Viet Minh regimental political officer, and he had been a battalion commander. So he was telling me how all this was after the war, how he said every French peasant knew that the Americans were supplying 80% of the funding for the French war by the end of it. I said, Chow, how can you tell me that illiterate French peasants, Vietnamese peasants knew something that essentially no Americans knew? The fact is that from the time of Nixon's speech on November 3rd, when he made it Nixon's war, the possibility of the Pentagon Papers having an effect didn't go down to zero, but it went close to zero in my mind, very low. From then on, I thought that it was a small chance that the Pentagon Papers could affect Nixon, because showing what the Democrats had done didn't have much bearing on Nixon. I didn't think it would affect his policy. And if leaping ahead, I would say it didn't affect his policy. When it did come out in 71, his immediate perception was that it affected mainly the Democrats. And as Kissinger put it, if anything, it helps us a little bit. And Nixon saw the same. In fact, he wanted it out faster, the Ziem part out even before it came out, and other parts out faster. Why did I put it out at all? Because by the spring of 1971, I was feeling that with the attack, actually from the fall of 1970, with the San Tay raid, I saw the escalation, which had been foreshadowed in Cambodia, as speeding up and moving toward probably an all-out escalation, which I wanted to avoid at all costs. And that the smallest chance of having some effect on the war was worth my going to prison for the rest of my life. I was urged to do that by Mark Raskin and Dick Barnett of the Institute of Policy Studies, to whom I'd given about 1,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers a year earlier for a historical project they were putting out, a book project. And they suggested that I give it to the newspapers. By that time, I had just given up on Fulbright, not until then. Till then, I'd hoped that he would put it out in hearings. I had that high hope in Cambodia, but it went away with the lapsing of political pressure to get out after he took the troops out of Cambodia. So, but in the fall, I became desperate. I was working in every way possible. I could go into a lot of activities I was doing that seemed, all of which seemed more relevant than the Pentagon Papers. But I thought, all right, the Pentagon Papers, might as well throw them into the pot too and get them out. And for what it's worth, maybe it'll have some effect in discrediting the war. And that was especially true after the Laos invasion. And so I approached Senator Mathias, I approached Senator McGovern. This was in the spring now, after I gave up on Fulbright. Mm-hmm. I did give them to Neil Sheehan, but without the expectation that the Times would put them out. And he didn't tell me they were working on them. He, for reasons still not clear to me entirely, chose not to tell me that the Times was moving ahead very rapidly, though it took them several months, as they saw it, to get it in order. So during that time, I continued to see Pete McCloskey, representative, in hopes that he would put them out. Senator Mathias, I tried out Senator Gaylord Nelson, Senator McGovern. McGovern and McCloskey and Mathias were all very favorable to putting them out at first, but then thought better of it and delayed. Or I think in retrospect they all thought, let Ellsberg put it out and whatever negative facts will come out. What people think of as Watergate, generally, like the dirty tricks, the campaign contributions, the enemies list, the entry into the Watergate itself, these are things, none of which has ever been traced conclusively, directly to Nixon himself. Partly because people like Mitchell and Haldeman did not talk, basically, or Liddy, about what they knew, and essentially took the blame for these moves. And whether Nixon actually knew of them in advance or actually directed them is still not clear, certainly was not proven against Nixon. None of that would have forced him to resign or could have led to his impeachment. As I understand it, what made him vulnerable to impeachment and even to prosecution and to conviction were actions that were known to be directed directly from the Oval Office, and those were in particular actions that involved me, a little more generally the anti-war movement, but in particularly against me. And it's often been understood that those actions were impulsive somehow, or were somehow reflected his psychology, personal psychology in some way, were essentially irrational or overreactions of some sort. And certainly it's not understood that they were related to Vietnam. To say that is to say that Watergate is not usually seen as related to Vietnam. In fact, I would say that what brought Nixon to the point of resignation or impeachment was very much closely related to his Vietnam policy, his secret policy, and particularly to how I fitted in, or I related to that policy. So the Pentagon Papers was related to it. But it wasn't really so much the Pentagon Papers themselves, which dealt almost entirely with the Democrats, except for the Eisenhower period, of which Nixon had been part. What I think worried Nixon about me was what I might, or what he thought I knew about his secret policy in Vietnam and what I could reveal with documents. In other words, my understanding is that he became very concerned about what I might reveal beyond the Pentagon Papers, about his own administration, and that I might well have documents to back that up that would very much undermine his ongoing Vietnam policy. From that point of view, the actions he took or directed, which were in fact illegal, even criminal actions in many respects, were, I believe in his mind, and with some reason, seen as national security matters. When he wanted to attribute his motivation as national security, I don't think that was just a cover story in his mind, that he really did think of me as threatening national security, as he understood it. Obviously, in going after me with the plumbers, with my doctor's office, obviously that had nothing to do with his campaign, like so many other matters of Watergate. It clearly wasn't the campaign, or it wasn't political in general. It was, I think, as he saw it, national security, which depended, as he saw it, and most presidents would, on his success, his ability to be successful in carrying out his policy, his Vietnam policy. He understandably saw that as best for the country and best for our national security. And I threatened that by threatening to make it public. He understood, and Kissinger understood from the beginning, that his aims in Vietnam called for tactics that the public would be scared of at the best. They would see as reckless and perhaps as totally wrong. And there would be, if not majority opposition, there would at least be major minority controversy and opposition, which he wanted to avoid. That would increase the political costs of his policy. It would make it harder to achieve at best. It might make it impossible. Very specifically, he had reason to believe that I knew of his nuclear threats to North Vietnam in as early as the spring of 1969 and the fall of 1969 and later, and of his threats to escalate in terms of the dikes and other matters. In other words, his threats to escalate. In fact, I did know of them to some extent. I didn't have documents to demonstrate them, but I could have. The documents were available to people like Roger Morris, who wrote a number of them, or Tony Lake, or Bill Watts, or Larry Lynn, all of whom resigned at the time of Cambodia. So he had strong reason to fear that in resigning, they might well have shared those documents with me and passed them on, and that I might turn them up at some point. What I did do was to give National Security Study Memorandum 1, the notes on that, to Senator Mathias, who was, unlike the others I dealt with, a Republican senator, and who wanted to keep his credentials to some extent with the Republicans, even though he was a dissenter on the Vietnam War. What I learned in 73 and 74 was that on June 13th, the day that the Pentagon Papers came out in the Pentagon, in the Times, or possibly June 14th, Mathias called up his colleague John Mitchell, his acquaintance, and said, who was then no longer Attorney General, he was the head of committee to re-elect the president. Let's see, 71? Perhaps he was still Attorney General.
Yeah, it's early 72.
Yeah.
Early 72.
He was still Attorney General. And he called him up and said, John, there's something you ought to know. And revealed to Mitchell that he had top secret documents from me, from Daniel Ellsberg, in his office. And all of this turned out to be critical. He didn't agree immediately to turn them over, just inform them that he had them and say that they could look at them in his office, which they didn't do right away. In retrospect, then, there was a period when Nixon and Kissinger understood that Mathias had documents, I should say that I had documents that I had not yet released. They were on Vietnam, they were on Nixon's policy in Vietnam, and they were from the National Security Council. That's what Mathias told Mitchell. That gave them, but they didn't know exactly what they were. If they had known exactly what they were, Kissinger would have said, oh, that's Nissim I, perhaps that's all he has. I had actually written the questions for Nissim I. I had gone over all the answers, and I had helped Winston Lord write the summary for the president of Nissim I. So it was very plausible that I had all the documents on that, and that was all I had. That was the only project I worked on for Nixon, and it was all I had from Nixon. As it was, they didn't know what it was Mathias had. They had every reason to believe that there was a mole in the National Security Council who was providing me with who knows what. It could have been anything. And as they discuss on the tapes, Tony Lake essentially knew everything, and he'd resigned at the time of Cambodia. Mort Halpern knew a lot, but didn't know everything. Roger Morris knew somewhat less. Any one of them could have given me documents. Even Bill Watts or Larry Lynn, who also left. So I could turn up with documents on nuclear threats, on mining, on invasions, on any kind of thing, all of which were still totally secret from the American public and from Congress and from most people in the government. And the tapes show Nixon showing a great deal of concern about this. What do they know? What did Halpern know? What I might come out with? Now, all of this is coming out at the end of June, beginning of July, in the tapes, which is after, of course, the Supreme Court decision, after they've gone on ahead with the Pentagon Papers, which Nixon is basically fine to have out. In fact, he wants hearings on them, incriminating the public. But now, as he says to Kissinger, this changes the picture. We thought all he had was on the Democrats. This shows that he could, so there's a lot of discussion, how closely is he held, could Laird have had this stuff, who could have had it, and so forth. What about Haiphong, which is mentioned specifically, and so forth, which hadn't yet happened. These were threats for plans that had been laid as early as '69, but hadn't yet been carried out. They weren't carried out till '72, a year later. To show them actually when they were carried out, in '72, they were presented as an ad hoc response to the North Vietnamese offensive, which has just taken place. To have it come out even that late, that these things had been laid in motion, in process, and been planned out with targets picked and everything, as early as '69, would put in question his whole strategy and also what his aims were. In other words, things that implied, how long is this going to go on? How big can this get? In fact, let me go ahead to 72. I'd been on trial now, under indictment for a year at that point. I called up, with the mining of Haiphong, I called up Mort Halpern in Washington and said, well, Mort, what you revealed to me in 69 has now been played out. You know, what's next? Is it over? You know, and what's going next? And Mort said, no, he hasn't bombed Hanoi yet. He said, Mort had said to me in 69, it was his judgment, this administration will not leave office after its first term without having bombed Hanoi. They will have tried that in order, in other words, to get his maximum objective, which was to get North Vietnamese troops out of Vietnam. If he hasn't tried that, he won't, he will try it if he hasn't done it yet. And that's what actually did happen. So I actually went to the Nixon convention, the Republican convention in Miami in 72, at a press conference sponsored by Pete McCloskey, who was running against Nixon and got one vote that week in Miami. McCloskey sponsored me at a press conference, at which I could reveal, I said, what Nixon's secret plan was. And I said to the convention, I should say to the journalists, all of whom were present, because they had very little news to report from that convention. Nixon was unopposed, essentially, except for McCloskey. And there was very little news coming out of it. So they all appeared for Daniel Ellsberg's press conference, and I said, 4 years ago, Nixon implied, he didn't use the word secret plan, but he implied that he had a secret plan. It's been widely believed since then that he did not have a secret plan. Most histories say that to this day. But he did. I said he did have a secret plan, essentially for winning the war, or at least stabilizing it at a level that would represent an American success. And I don't think you should vote, that he should be voted for again by the Republicans and the public without knowing what his secret plan was. By this time, I did have the outlines of it better. So I proceeded to tell. And I said, part of this plan involves threatening, and if necessary, carrying out the bombing of Hanoi, which hadn't happened yet. I was reported on, respectfully, for one day. But essentially, no one believed me. I didn't have documents proving that. As I said earlier, if I'd had such documents in 69 or 70, I would have put them out then. But I still didn't have them, and without documents, people weren't willing to believe that Nixon had a plan, had a strategy. They just couldn't imagine a strategy that would make any sense. If I can, they just didn't credit the thought that he actually had a strategy, and that the escalations that had actually occurred by that time, they still couldn't believe, reflected prior planning. They saw them as impulsive, as reactions to escalations by the other side, or they just didn't have an explanation. Generally, they couldn't. I think there were very few people in the country who could have answered the question, why are we still in Vietnam? Starting from the starting point that they all accepted, Nixon's trying to get us out. Well, why hasn't he? They didn't. No one has had an answer, and most people don't have an answer to this day. Why it took as long. When Nixon died, his obituaries in the Post and the Times essentially said Nixon's intention was to get us out as fast as possible. Nixon ended the war. And then they went on to other things with very little attention to the fact that Nixon dropped much more bomb tonnage on Indochina than Johnson or Kennedy had altogether. Johnson and Kennedy, 3.2 million tons of bombs. Nixon, 4.5 million tons of bombs. 2 World War IIs plus Korea. We dropped 2 million tons in all of World War II. Nixon dropped 4.5 million tons on Indochina. About 30,000 people died, somewhat less, under Johnson. Close to that died, 58,000 died in the end, about 28,000 under Nixon. If his policy was to get us out as quickly as possible, what went wrong? Why did it take these extra years so long? Essentially, almost nobody has an answer. The answer I would give is this. Their initial hopes were that the threats would cause the North to get mutual withdrawal, and with mutual withdrawal, Thieu would be able to control the situation with continued U.S. air support. That was his objective. When Duck Hook was not carried out because of the moratorium, they then went into a different gear that over time their threats would erode the other side, and eventually they would get mutual withdrawal. That was a very unrealistic belief, but by now they were quite invested in this approach. It was Nixon's war by this time. So they should have just, from an American point of view, or even their own point of view, they should have turned around to an extrication strategy. But they were still hoping to get mutual withdrawal. They never did get it. By 72, however, they got the demonstration that American B-52s in close air support of ARVN, the Saigon Army, could in fact hold off the North Vietnamese regime. That was an experiment that had never been done in history. It was a duel between high-altitude strategic bombers at 30,000 feet and ground armies. There'd never been anything remotely like that before. I couldn't predict how that would come out at the time. The thought of actually putting out the Pentagon Papers did not come to me until essentially almost the day that I did it. Tony Russo, who did not know that I had the Pentagon Papers or that I'd worked on them, when I mentioned that I was working on some studies that revealed a lot of lying, had said to me toward the end of September, you ought to put those out, which was a very amazing thing to say. It's not somebody who'd had a clearance and he no longer had one. Didn't make such a suggestion to anybody, or if he thought of putting anything out, wouldn't tell anybody else. But he was gone from RAND and was relatively radical. But that didn't mean to me that I would do it. Up till that point, I was now, as you may know from my book, I had come to a point by the example of Randy Keeler and Bob Eden, who were going to prison. I was ready to do anything in terms of self-sacrifice, going to prison or whatever, to help end the war. But putting out the Pentagon Papers did not look to me like a very plausible way of doing that, because they dealt with the Democrats. Then a week later or so, when I became very struck by the lies that were occurring over the special forces, this goes into my immediate motivations for putting them out at the moment, which is a long story. But when I became aware that so much lying had gone on, I thought that whether it has a big effect or not, it may have some effect, as I've described to you, on blaming all this on the Democrats. That may be helpful. And anyway, this history deserves, I was sick of the lying in part, and I was ready to see those documents put out, along with the other things I was doing in terms of trying to end the war. But in terms of putting them out through the newspapers, that didn't come to me. Well, first, as I say, I didn't even think of copying them until this point. Then I was going to give them to the Congress. Here's what I now understand happened. Nixon, pursuing a policy in 1971, which involved the possibility of continuing to escalate the war in terms of mining Haiphong, possibly even using nuclear weapons, various escalations. A policy that would be quite obstructed and undermined if the public understood the ambitiousness of his aims, which were to keep Thieu in office indefinitely and to keep the major cities under his control indefinitely. had to shut me up and keep me from revealing documents that I might still have, or he assumed I probably did have, that would reveal his planning going back to '69. The plumbers at this point, which had earlier been contemplated just to put out more documents, to undermine Ted Kennedy, to do various things, now I think had the task of neutralizing Ellsberg, not simply in terms of my credibility. I was, after all, already on trial. I was accused, ultimately, of having been guilty of 12 felony counts, basically, which challenges my credibility, you might say, already. I had to be influenced, coerced, into not putting out any more documents that will deal with Nixon. Basically, the first step they took there was to try to get information from my former psychoanalyst's office, Dr. Lewis Fielding in Beverly Hills, that I would not want out. It was not information in the main to be given out immediately to discredit me, but to threaten me with being put out if I didn't cooperate by shutting up, by ceasing to describe what Nixon's policy was, and by not putting out any more documents. So they wanted to get information they could blackmail me with, and a psychoanalyst's office seemed to be a logical place to do that. They didn't find information there that they could blackmail me with, and there wouldn't have been any. They wouldn't have succeeded in that anyway. I wouldn't have. I don't think I could have been blackmailed, but it was a good try that made sense. Later, when they were about to mine Haiphong, which took place on May 8th of 1972, when they were planning for that in the midst of the North Vietnamese offensive in 1972, they knew that I was now putting out more documents, and probably all that I had. They knew that because Senator Gravel attempted to put into the congressional record NISM 1, which I had given him, and was blocked by doing that by Republican senators, and there were two sessions, closed sessions in the Senate to consider whether they could legitimately receive such documents or publish them or whatever. Meanwhile, I had arranged for Gravel to give them to Representative Ron Dellums, who did put them in the House record, these 500 pages of secret and top secret documents. They knew then, at the end of April and early May, that I was now apparently foreseeing the mining of Haiphong, which I was openly predicting. And they wanted to stop me from that. So they brought 12 assets of the CIA, Bay of Pigs veterans, including all the people who had been involved in the break-in to Dr. Fielding's office earlier, in '69, and a number of others, all the ones who were later involved in the Watergate break-in. They were all brought up from Miami on May 3rd, 1972, with orders to, quote, incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally. And again, this was not a matter of pique on his part, but a fairly rational, though criminal, attempt to silence me, to put me in the hospital at least, or as the prosecutor thought, William Merrill, the prosecutor thought to kill me. I don't think the intention was to kill me, but rather to make sure that I was silent for the next couple of weeks, during which they were going to mine Haiphong. These were orders passed on by Charles Colson to Jeb Magruder, to Hunt and Liddy, to the Cubans, with Colson telling Magruder that the orders came from the man upstairs in the Oval Office. And as Magruder put it to his aide, when Colson says that, sometimes he's telling the truth. It really is from Nixon. So they carried it out. I think it was from Nixon, in fact. So these were orders to assault me, at least, if not to kill me, on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, '72. They didn't do it for reasons we could go into. They thought they were being set up to be caught, as one of them put it, like Oswald. And instead they blew the attempt. They did not assault me. They got into assaults on the edge of the crowd of other people and were led away by police, giving them an excuse for not attacking me. And spent that night, several of them, Barker and others, reconnoitering their next objective, which was the Watergate. They went into the Watergate 3 weeks later, and then on a second attempt, for reasons, by the way, we still don't know. Anyone who feels confident that they know exactly what the raid into the Watergate offices were or what the second raid was for does not have an adequate basis for confidence as far as I know yet, as far as any documents we know. That remains something of a mystery with various hypotheses going at it. And how much Nixon knew and so forth remains somewhat unclear. But the people who did it did know of the physical attempt to assault me weeks earlier on the Capitol and of the burglary of my psychoanalyst's office. As I say, both of those had a very rational motive connected to Nixon's Vietnam policy. And I actually believe that any president we've seen who had that policy, which was threatened to that extent by an insider who was threatening to release new documents, would have done pretty much the same. It wasn't just Nixon, Tricky Dick, and Dirty Nick, and so forth. This administration, of course, would have done it in a minute. But I think also really Johnson and possibly even Kennedy would have done much the same. Certainly in terms, I was overheard on wiretaps, warrantless wiretaps during this period. The use of the CIA against me, the sort of thing that Johnson had done before Nixon. The use, as I say, the FBI wiretaps. Break-ins, certainly done under earlier presidents and later presidents, are being done right now. In other words, it wasn't, I don't see it as Nixon's pathology. It was Nixon's political White House reaction to a threat to his secret and very controversial, potentially controversial foreign policy at that point. So now he had people arrested who knew of these earlier White House crimes, and they had to be kept from talking. First before the election, and then after the election. They were successfully kept quiet by various bribes during the election under Dean's direction. But as Dean pointed out, more and more people were learning about it. Hunt was demanding large amounts of money to keep quiet about the other crimes, the Ellsberg affair, as Nixon put it. And he had to be paid off. Again, any of the presidents in this situation would have done this. These were new crimes of obstruction of justice. And as Dean described it, a cancer on the presidency because they had a tendency to metastasize. The more people knew, the more people had to be kept quiet and had to be paid off. And these were new crimes. So it was metastasizing. In the end, it was Dean himself who, trying to avoid having the entire responsibility for the cover-up loaded on him, which was the Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman plan, to blame Dean for the cover-up. Dean was willing, he said, to go to prison for the president, but not for Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Also, he was not willing to perjure himself. He was a fairly unprincipled person at that time. He's learned a lot of principles, I think, since then. I like him a lot now. Dean is a friend of mine, and I believe he's a great truth teller. Now, at that time, he was still a White House man, as he put it, blind ambition. But he was not willing to perjure himself. And he revealed in the course of plea bargaining with the prosecutors the break-in to the doctor's office. That, I'm going to condense here very, very greatly. Nixon did his best, which was pretty good, to keep that from going to my trial for 13 days or so, from the 13th to the 26th. Nixon kept the knowledge of the Fielding break-in from going to my trial, where it clearly was his responsibility to inform the judge of this break-in, and also of the NSA, the FBI wiretaps against me. He ordered the material not go. Finally, Kleindienst and Peterson, on, I believe, April 25th, 24th or 25th, went into him and implied they would have to resign because they would be guilty of obstruction of justice if they didn't pass that material on. Nixon, on the 25th, then authorizes Kleindienst to give the information to my judge, to tell the judge that it was national security, which I think he believed, meaning he doesn't have to give it to the defendant. It should be kept under wraps, if possible. He hoped the judge would obey that hint because he was offering at that time, Judge Matthew Byrne, another obstruction of justice, he was offering the head of the FBI, something that Judge Byrne had wanted since he was a little boy. It was his boyhood ambition, someday to replace J. Edgar Hoover as head of the FBI. He was offered that on April 4th, I believe it was, and again on April 5th, and again April 7th in meetings during my trial, which was, Byrne was going on and was discussing possibly becoming head of the FBI without telling us. That leaked out from the Washington Star, I think it was, apparently by some FBI man who didn't want Byrne to be head of the FBI. Almost surely Mark Felt, we now know as Deep Throat, was the one who leaked that to the Washington Star. So gradually now you had a whole lot of leaks coming out, first from Dean. Byrne did have to give it to us in court on April 26th, I think. And
tell us about your reaction.
What? Well, tremendous. You know, I mean, there was Byrne offered to keep it secret. He looked at me for the first time, he looked me in the eyes for 2 years. The first time he addressed me in court for 2 years, he always talked to my lawyers or to the prosecution or whatever, and he said, "Mr. Ellsberg, I don't have to put this out," meaning I don't have to reveal to the world that you had a psychoanalyst, which was not a real stigma in Los Angeles, actually, at that point. And anyway, the White House had done a burglary of my doctor's office. I said to him, "Are you kidding? Put it out." So he announced it in open court, and there was a rush from the journalist booth for the first time, a front page scene where they dashed to the phones to get out the word that, as they put it, Watergate meets the Pentagon Papers trial. They'd been having a very dull trial most of the time for months at this point, and suddenly they were all envying their colleagues in Washington who were covering Watergate, and suddenly they were covering Watergate, and so they were very excited by it, and it was that led now to a wonderful 10 days for us, because if you want to know my mood, the rest of the trial was extremely a combination of boring and tedious and stressful and frustrating, and at a time that I didn't want to look back on or relive in the slightest. The last 10 days were glorious. Each day there was a new revelation. Hunt reveals the CIA profile and the plumbers and the break-in to the doctor's office. Then the taps come out, and then the CIA profile. The fact that Gray had destroyed material relating to me, the head of the FBI, in his home fireplace. It was just one wonderful revelation after another, and we would have been glad to see it go on, but it was leaked out, the offer of the FBI to the judge, who had not revealed it to us, and the judge dismissed that as the grounds for dismissal. We made a motion for dismissal of the trial at that point. He said no, that had not affected him as judge, that offer. And he said he had not discussed the trial at all, or had not discussed the FBI directorship. That was not true, as Ehrlichman, who had been part of the conversation, revealed. So lying, criminality, obstruction was just tumbling out at this point. And these were essentially the crimes that put Nixon in great trouble, vulnerability of going to prison, because they were crimes that directly involved him. After impeachment, there was every reason to expect prosecution. He needed that pardon, which Ford gave him as a condition of becoming his vice president, it turns out. So a pardon which, of course, Ford gave him as a blanket pardon for whatever crimes he might have committed, not knowing what the crimes were at all. He knew these by this time, but who knows what else. I believe that Charles Colson could give you a dozen other crimes that were involved. I could hypothesize some of them quite specifically.
Dr. Fielding had not told you about the break-in, had he?
No, he had not.
Did you have a chat with him about this afterwards?
Oh yeah, I had much discussion. I'd seen him during the trial, not in a therapist, not as analysis, and all he did was classical analysis, but sitting up and talking to him about what was going on, really because I wanted him to have a sense of how he felt I was doing. Actually, this isn't what psychoanalysts don't give you much feedback like that. A different therapist could have. But I thought, well, I'm under a lot of stress here, and maybe there's signs of it that I'm not aware of, so that he would note and be able to caution me on. So I did see him, I think, every week or every couple of weeks during the trial, just to tell him what was going on. And he never told me. What he did say was, I can't guarantee to you that this office is secure anymore. I said, that it might be bugged. And I said, no, that's paranoid, if I may say. No, I don't think they'd bug your office. Why would they do that? I might say, by the way, that when we moved out of our apartment at Bunker Hill, it was called, the apartments, the weekend we moved out at the end of the trial, a CBS crew came in to shoot a commercial in our apartment, which had a very good corner view of Los Angeles. And the plug, the wall plug was not working when they tried to plug their camera in, their lights in. And so the cameraman took apart the fixtures and found a bug in it. I said, how did you know it was a bug? He said, well, I was in counterintelligence in Korea. So he looked around elsewhere in the apartment and found another bug in the bedroom. So we had bedrooms throughout the trial in our living room and our bedroom. And Fielding could well have been true. There may well have been a bug that's never been mentioned in his room. But anyway, I didn't know why he would have such a suspicion. Well, when it came out that they had broken into his apartment, his office, I then did discuss that with him. And he said that he knew that it was White House and he knew it was after me from the beginning. Because, now this will tie in with some of your other interviews, it's almost always been said that nothing was found with my name on it, and they had photographed nothing in Fielding's office. Actually, Barker had mentioned that they had photographed things in the office, documents in the office. And Martinez, I think, had also mentioned in one interview, I think it was his Harper's interview, that he had photographed things in the office. What did he photograph? Well, Fielding told me a long paper that I'd written, a 68-page paper, called Escalating in a Quagmire. It was the heart of my book, Papers on the War. Was lying out from my file on the file cabinet, which is now in the Smithsonian. The file drawers were open, and this document by me was sitting on top of the file, as if he were meant to notice who they were after. And this document actually could have been potentially of some interest to them, because it was a long study that I did of decision-making on Vietnam, which was based on the Pentagon Papers. And in fact, it had quotes from the Pentagon Papers in it. And I had said, without identifying that, and I had said in the document very provocatively, I wanted to see what would happen. I wrote this in 1970. I had said in it that I had had access to classified documents. This is never said, and people write papers on this stuff. And to see if people would pick up on that. I'd copied the Pentagon Papers a year earlier.
That's right.
I'd tried to get them out through the Senate.
Yeah.
I now wanted to put out a lot of the substance of what I'd learned in this document. And maybe the story will get out that way. but nobody was willing to publish it because it was only history. It was turned down by everybody, even though I offered to shorten it. Great.
And you gave it to your psychoanalyst?
I gave it to my psychoanalyst, but I gave it to lots of people all over the place. I gave it to Henry Kissinger. I gave it to many Democrats. And everybody said, very, very interesting. Kissinger's office had it, interesting stuff. And nobody commented on the fact that it obviously was based on classified documents, and that although people were always writing memoirs based on classified documents, they never said that. That was fairly challenging.
Dr. Fielding, did he explain why he didn't tell you that he thought the White House?
Yes. He said that we upset him very much. He knew that he was sure that it was the White House. Remember, this was 1969. They had not come out yet. But he knew what I'd been doing. I told him what I was doing. I left him in, let me see when I ended. When I went to Washington, to Cambridge, in basically July of 1969 is when I ended. Is that right? 1969. So I'm sorry. Yes, he saw the file cabinet was broken into in Labor Day weekend, 1969.
No, Labor Day weekend of 1971.
1971, right. So the Pentagon Papers had come out. That's the connection.
That's right.
That's sorry. So 37 years ago.
No, it's under
35 years ago.
Hold on for like 15 seconds here and see if this phone goes away.
No, phone is still, wait.
There we go.
I thought I disconnected. Yeah, okay. So the Pentagon Papers had come out in June.
Right.
So he knew all that. So he now knows, the White House is very interested in this. And so somebody has burgled his office. He was certain it was the White House. But I wasn't seeing him then. I was in Cambridge. He wasn't in direct touch with me. I called him. Something else happened. But let me come to this point. His lawyer, he talked to a lawyer about it. And the lawyer advised him, don't get involved. Don't get involved. It's a White House operation on this, and don't tell him. He said, he apologized to me. He said, I felt guilty. He said, I feel I wronged you, which from professional point of view, he certainly had, and I apologize. I said, fine. Everything had turned out fine by that time, of course. However, it bothered him so much that he got a bleeding ulcer, and at one point it hemorrhaged, and he went to the hospital, the emergency room, with a bleeding ulcer. So it bothered him enough. He already had hypertension. So it bothered him enough that it worsened his hypertension and gave him a bleeding ulcer, but not enough to tell me. Not a wonderful performance, but it was pretty much like everybody else I dealt with on the thing. I could go into a dozen similar examples. They all acted pretty much the same. But in his case, now other analysts used to tell me, you were blessed in your analyst that he didn't cooperate with the FBI when the FBI approached him. That's why they went into his office. I said, well, how could he cooperate? He's my psychoanalyst. And others told me, other analysts would have cooperated.
And you stopped seeing him when you went to Cambridge. What year did you go to Cambridge?
In 70.
In 70.
Right. So I got actually an estimate. Many people came up with pretty much the same estimate of the odds. They said that about 90% of psychiatrists would have cooperated with the FBI, given that it was a national security matter, without telling me, and perhaps 75% of psychoanalysts, a smaller number. Everybody gave the same percentages. And so their hope that they would get something out of him. Now, people have thought that they were foolish to think they would get notes from a psychoanalyst. They didn't know much about psychoanalysis, of course. Hunt and, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Krogh were all Christian Scientists. as I had been and my father was. And I wondered what it meant for them to be going after a fellow Christian Scientist. There's a good deal of collegial feeling among Christian Scientists. So when I asked Ehrlichman and Krogh separately, I saw Ehrlichman later, and Krogh is now a friend of mine, how did you feel about going after a Christian Scientist? They had not discovered that I was a Christian Scientist, which was not a secret. It's why I gave the Pentagon papers to the Christian Science Monitor. My father had given me practically a life subscription to the Christian Science Monitor. He was a big, very fanatic Christian Scientist. They had a whole room filled with documents on Daniel Ellsberg and somehow never picked up that I was a fellow Christian Scientist. And I asked Krogh and Holderman how they would have felt if they'd felt. Well, they would have felt very strange about that, that would not have gone unnoticed. It was much easier for them to imagine that I might be a Soviet agent, not knowing that I was a Christian Scientist, than if they had known. But anyway, what they were after was information that could blackmail me, as I say, into silence. That was not likely to be in notes, and in fact, Fielding now told me, now that I'm talking to him, that I asked him, did you keep notes? And he said, no. At the very beginning of an analysis, I would take down names of relatives and critical people to understand relationships. And then when I'd memorized those, I would tear up my notes and throw them down the toilet. I said, how did you get into a habit like that? He said, I was General Patton's 3rd Army medical officer in the 3rd Army. A little biographical detail that I didn't know, of course.
Now there is a character.
Since he was a blank slate, as far as I was concerned, it would have given me something to think about, that I was telling all this stuff I was doing to General Patton's medical officer.
I was going to say General Patton and Daniel Ellsberg, two rather interesting historical figures.
Well, you remember that, after all, show how things connect, 6 degrees of separation here. Nixon nerved himself up into the invasion of Cambodia by watching Patton about 6 times. George C. Scott, possibly more than that.
And then later the administration breaks into Patton's military officer's office.
Yeah, well, right. That would have given Nixon something to think about. So they were just as interested in getting information on Fielding. And they, in fact, I think Martinez, who was a CPA, was he not? Wasn't he the accountant?
No, Martinez wasn't.
Was not? One of them was. One of the people in the group was, in fact, Barker. He was in real estate.
Yeah.
Anyway, they looked at his real estate, his income tax returns. And Barker said in the Harper's article, I got the impression that the good doctor, quote, was not reporting all of his income tax. Now, why did they care about that? Fine. Just as good as getting stuff on me. They wanted to be able to blackmail Fielding into telling them about what I'd told him. Stuff that wasn't written down. Squeeze Fielding, who was one of that 25% of psychoanalysts who wouldn't cooperate, get him to cooperate. So I think that's what they had in mind when they thought of going into his home. They proposed going into his home. Maybe he kept his notes there. But if he didn't keep his notes there, and he didn't have any notes, they could get stuff on him there that they could blackmail him with, which was what. Now, why did they put the document on top of the file? Why did they leave it in such a mess? Why did they make it so obvious that the place had been broken into? They broke the file open, they jimmied open the door, I believe, in the end. Or no, they broke a window down below. They scattered pills, supposedly to make it look like a drug addict who was coming in to get pills around the floor. There's another little mysterious point here. Martinez and Barker report they come back to the Hunt's and Liddy's suite in the Beverly Hilton and tell him what's happened. And Barker Hunt is waiting with champagne to celebrate the break-in. Well, he opens the champagne anyway and pours it around to celebrate has a celebration. And one of them says, "What are we celebrating? We didn't find anything," which is not quite true. And Hunt says, I think this is in the Harper's article, "We know that, but he doesn't know that."
Tonight on the Civil War, the burning of Columbia. On February 17, 1865, Columbia, South...
Comments. Join the C-SPAN conversation. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter.
While working at the Rand Corporation in 1967, Daniel Ellsberg became a consultant to the White House and Defense Department on matters concerning the Vietnam War, giving him access to classified and top-secret documents. He photocopied a 7,000-page study that later became known as the Pentagon Papers, and in 1971 gave those documents to the New York Times. Coming up next, part 2 of a 2-part interview with Daniel Ellsberg. He talks about handing over the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, the fallout of the leak, and his arrest and trial, which spanned from June 1971 to May 1973. The Richard Nixon Presidential Library conducted this interview as part of a project to document the 37th President's administration. This portion is about 50 minutes.
On Labor Day weekend, Hunt and Liddy, after their unsuccessful operation in the Fielding break-in, go back to Washington via New York. They stay at the Pierre, I believe. No, it was the... What was the hotel that Kennedy was famous for going into all the time? Going to? I associate with Kennedy all the time. What's the one that...
The Plaza?
The Plaza. The Plaza, I think. The one that the little girl... you remember all the little lines?
Madeline?
Madeline.
Right.
Isn't that the Plaza?
I don't.
Anyway, just connected to my head.
Yes.
They stay at this hotel. Very fine hotel for them to stay at. That weekend, I think on a Sunday, the office of Senator Goodell is broken into. Again, my memory isn't perfect on all the names here, but I believe the name of Goodell's assistant was Andrew Pierre. I think that might be it, Andrew Pierre. And he told me there was no question there had been a burglary of the files that weekend in Goodell's office. Now, my former wife, getting very complicated here, had told the FBI back in 1969 that I had given... I'm sorry, let me get that wrong. She had told her stepmother, and her stepmother told the FBI. Her stepmother told the FBI back in '69 that I had given the Pentagon Papers to Fulbright and Goodell. And of course, by this time, Goodell had actually already been almost written out of the Republican Party. He'd lost office by his anti-war sense. But he was also known to be very connected with me. From '69 on, I had been consulting with Goodell, but I had not given him the Pentagon Papers. But they believed I had. So they exaggerated the degree of my intimacy with Goodell. The FBI thought I'd given the papers to Goodell. So Goodell's office is broken into on that weekend. And their office, and I went and visited it, is, as I recall, about 2 blocks from the plaza, from where they were staying. So I think Hunt and Liddy, on the way home, something that's never come out, made a little operation into Goodell's office. And presumably with some others. They didn't do burglarizing themselves, but they probably had some other help on that. Didn't matter in the end.
Did you ever ask Bud Krogh about that?
Yeah, I think I did, and he did not remember or did not know. But that's, as to what he did know and didn't know, it's another story of interest. He didn't believe that he knew everything they'd been up to by any means. He believed he did not know. So, I mean, if we were unraveling all of this stuff, it would be interesting. So, how did that bear? Oh, yes. Why would they be interested in my wife's analyst and so forth? the plumbers were, that is the Cubans who worked for Hunt and Liddy, were interviewed at great length by Taylor Branch and George Cryle for a book they were doing on the plumbers' operation, on the Bay of Pigs veterans, actually. Their book never came out because their publisher went bankrupt, and Hunt and Branch and Cryle had a fight over how they would split the royalties or something if they found another publisher, and it never did come out. And I was very anxious to get the files from Branch, but they both, that's a whole other story, but I didn't get it. However, Branch told me at the time a good deal about what they were after, what he'd learned from the Cubans. And he said, Branch said to me, and he confirmed this later, well, when I was writing my book, I checked it with him, that the Cubans, and I think they had talked to Martinez and to Barker and some of the others, and I can't identify who told what to them, but they learned from the Cubans that their objective was to find, there were 4 objectives in this effort to neutralize me altogether. To get information basically that I didn't want known, blackmail type information. Their hopes were, the highest hope was that I would commit suicide, which was what, rather than have this material come out, which was of course what the FBI in the COINTEL program did exactly with Martin Luther King. They sent him a tape of his sexual escapades in a hotel room with a note saying, you will know what to do. You have only one course of action. It was just before he got the Nobel Prize. And many others have discussed, I can give you references on this if you don't know it already, that their highest hope was he would commit suicide if he did that. Otherwise, they would put it out and discredit him, hopefully. So their hope was that I would commit suicide. Second, that I would leave the country, go to Cuba, like various other people had done. Eldridge Cleaver, so forth. Timothy Leary, Algeria. Obviously, again, putting me out of action. Both of those keep me quiet very effectively. Third, that I will, what was it? One of the things was I would not go on the stand. And interestingly, they had been told a story which is very little known. And here were these Cubans who don't even, some of them hardly speak English, or very good English. They'd heard it from Hunt, obviously, and Liddy. But they had the anecdote in mind of the Hiss case, where Hiss's stepson was kept off the stand, and he was the only person who could testify to the critical question of how often Hiss had seen Chambers. You know, which was crucial to the question. Hiss admitted he'd seen Chambers, but how intimate was the relationship? And the FBI had threatened, informally, Hiss that they would let it be known in cross-examination of this son that he was homosexual. And Hiss had not permitted him to be on the stand. The son himself was willing to go on the stand anyway, and Hiss said, no, that would ruin your life at that time. I won't let this happen. So he didn't get that corroborating testimony that he had not seen, his testimony, that he had not seen Chambers very much. This was a story that that was in the minds of these Cuban Americans. You know, a very esoteric story, which, you know, other people have testified to, and which may or may not be true. But anyway, they had it. That was the kind of information they wanted. So Branch said, from the Cubans, they were as interested in information that would be on your children or your wife as on you. Anything that I wouldn't want told that could, at the very least, keep me off the stand, which would mean that I would be convicted. It wouldn't in itself. And then I think the other point was keep me from telling. Now, Krogh has told me, and it's in my book, I quote him, telling the judge, actually. his number one priority as the man in charge of quote, neutralizing me was, what other information did I have and would I put it out? And who might I be getting it from? That's your critical conspiracy. Who might still be in the administration who is giving me or other people information about him, not about the Pentagon Papers? The concern of the plumbers under Krogh and Hunt and so forth was, what else could I put out beyond the Pentagon Papers that would tell of Nixon's Vietnam policy? And that's what I mean when I say the crimes of going into all these different, I think a lot of different little burglaries, and my doctor's office, trying to shut me up, break my mouth. Barker said to Lloyd Shearer of Parade, the editor of Parade, my orders were to break both his legs. Well, that would put me in the hospital, but not keep me from talking. I think somebody else had orders to take care of my jaw. But all these different crimes, the purpose of them, that would not have happened had I given Nissum 1 to McGovern. He wouldn't have told Nixon that I'd given it to him. He did say I'd put out the Pentagon Papers for other reasons, because he was running for president and wanted that publicity. But but it was Mathias who had the incentive to confess to the administration immediately, but that he had documents from the NSC from me, but fortunately, from my point of view, did not tell them what it was. In fact, he hardly knew what it was. He didn't know the significance of it. NSC documents which suggested immediately a mole from the NSC and the possibility that I had, the likelihood that I had documents on mining, on Haiphong, on nuclear weapons and so forth, and I had to be stopped. This led to crimes, which again could have been kept secret, if the criminals themselves had not, CIA assets, they didn't think of themselves as criminals, of course, but as warriors, covert warriors, patriots. So had they not been caught, again, if they'd talked earlier, it would have come out. If Fielding had told me, against the advice of his lawyer, that his office had been broken into by the White House, we would, of course, have put that out. And the plumbers would not have been hired to go to work for creep. The people who were, even though the police wouldn't have known who did it, but they would know. They, I don't think, would have used those people again that the police were looking for to go into the offices of the Democratic National Committee. So the people who did go in would not have had these earlier crimes to reveal. They wouldn't have had to be kept secret by the smoking gun, by pretending that it was a CIA operation. Altogether, that was the smoking gun conversation. Hunt wouldn't have had to be paid off $100,000 or $140,000, et cetera, et cetera. Now, none of this guaranteed that Nixon would leave office. A lot of other things had to follow too. Butterfield had to reveal the tapes. The Supreme Court had to decide, as it was, that the tapes had to be given over. The Saturday Night Massacre. A lot of things had to happen. Nixon was not terribly reckless to believe that he could commit crimes like this and keep them quiet. Presidents did this kind of thing all the time, and nearly all of them they kept quiet. And moreover, once they come out, George W. Bush has committed crimes like this right and left, and a lot of them have come out, and he's still there. I don't say he would get reelected this year if he was running, but he's going to live out his office. He didn't get impeached. None of his officials have gone to prison, even Libby, whom he essentially pardoned. As he himself was pardoned. So he wasn't unusually reckless in doing this. He had bad luck. But he was vulnerable. There was a possibility, and he took that risk to preserve a Vietnam policy that he thought would work foolishly, but not impossibly. He was wrong, and actually did work up to a point. In fact, he did get reelected in '72 despite the war still going on. I believe it was entirely, there's a lot of evidence on this, his intention to renew the bombing of North Vietnam as soon as American troops were out in March, April 1973. According to Time magazine in 1975, he had given the order to renew the bombing in April. But Dean, on April 13th, told the prosecutors, or 13th or 15th, there's a little confusion about that. Dean told the prosecutors, who promptly, illegally, told Nixon. Nixon keeps it quiet from going again for another 10 days or more, but it does come out, and now he's in deep trouble. Byrne has to put it out because he knows that now that Dean is talking, it's going to come out. So he can't sit on it any longer. He has to put it out. And Nixon lost all that.
So you believe this is the most important information that Dean told the prosecutors?
Oh, it was crucial that Dean told the prosecutor. Oh, it was crucial. He'd told them lots of stuff up till then, but it didn't involve the president. He deliberately kept from involving the president, I think, for various reasons, maybe loyalty, but also a fight with the president, Dean knew very well, is a very dangerous process. In fact, by that time, he knew that they were dealing with people who were assassins. Hunt had organized, managed efforts to assassinate Castro. One of the other operations the plumbers were involved in was a plot to assassinate Torrijos at that time. Do you know about that?
No.
Yourself? Good for the Nixon Library. Come on, I can give you the references on that.
Okay.
But they were all involved in a plot to assassinate, and they'd done actions to further the plot, to assassinate Torrijos in order to get the Panama Canal through, what was it? To have another canal go through, widen the canal or something like that. I think there was some idea of a sea level canal. And Torrijos was in the way of that. So they were going to assassinate. Torrijos did, of course, later die in a plane crash, an unexplained train crash. But that's why, this seems to be why, for example, Hunt and Dita Beard were all involved in the break-in to Greenspung's office in Las Vegas. Had something to do with Howard Hughes and the Torrijos affair. It's all complicated, but there are records on this. A guy named Jonathan Marshall did a very good investigation of this in Inquiry magazine. I can put you on to that. In '68, I gave Neil a series of top secret leaks, including Westmoreland's year-end report, eyes only for the president, top secret, which this was right after the Tet Offensive that I was doing this. And his report, which was only a month or so earlier, it ended in late January, told the president that we have, to paraphrase it, we have driven the Viet Cong out of South Vietnam to the borders where we are pursuing them. We're pursuing them on the borders. This was 10 days or so before the Viet Cong hit simultaneously every province capital in Vietnam and Saigon in a 2-day period. So it made Westmoreland look quite bad. And the day that actually was leaked in the New York Times, Westmoreland was told that afternoon that he would be replaced by Creighton Abrams. I was anxious to see Westmoreland replaced because I knew that he was likely to use nuclear weapons over Dien Bien Phu, over Khe Sanh, which they were afraid would be another Dien Bien Phu. So that's another story, that's why I did it. But I foresaw the president giving Westmoreland a large part of what he just asked for secretly, 206,000 troops. You've read this story in my
in the book.
So anyway, I had complicated reasons for wanting to get this information out. Mainly, I wanted the President, Johnson, to feel that his administration at high levels had suddenly become transparent, a goldfish bowl, that he would not be able to give Westmoreland secretly 100,000 troops or 200,000 troops and lie about what he was giving, as he had always done in the past. He had always given Westmoreland, until 67, more troops, a promise of more troops, than he revealed to the public. And so to keep him from doing that in this case, which I thought would lead to the invasion of North Vietnam, which is what Westmoreland wanted, and thus to Chinese involvement and eventual use of nuclear weapons. To keep him from doing that, to thinking that he could do it secretly, I wanted him to know that if he made that decision, it would leak out. And the way I thought of convincing him of that was to make a major top secret leak every day for a number of days. So I gave him, Neil Sheehan, that. I gave him the new order of battle, which doubled the estimate of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese we were facing, which otherwise would never have been revealed, and several other items to come out sequentially. And I felt that the Times had dealt with those quite well. And I trusted Neil's discretion on this, and he'd taken efforts to cover me on this in various ways. So that was all in 68, when Neil was the Pentagon representative of the Times. Now, I think that in 71, when I went to him, he was no longer, I can't remember this exactly, but I'm not sure he was any longer covering the Pentagon for the Times. But mainly, I'd gone to him before, and I trusted him, and he was in town. So when it came a question of giving it to somebody on the Times, Neil was the obvious person.
You went to Neil,
Yeah.
and at that point you had decided on a new strategy with the Pentagon Papers. Had you?
Yeah. So now it was suggested, why don't you, in fact, they suggested I give it to Neil Sheehan. I didn't know, well, they had already given it to Neil, 1,000 pages to Neil Sheehan.
They, you mean the three at the IPS?
The IPS people had already given 1,000 pages to Neil Sheehan. This is a part that has yet to be worked out at this late date, exactly what happened here, because Neil and Mark Raskin tell quite different stories. Not entirely different. They all agree that IPS gave a lot of documents to Neil Sheehan. And the significance of that is disputed, or what followed from that. It's pretty significant.
So you weren't the first to give Neil Sheehan Pentagon Papers?
No. Of course, I didn't know that until a year or two ago. Oh, well, no, I can tell you exactly when I learned. In the spring of 2002, I guess. Spring of 2002, Mark Raskin gave some interviews, which led me to talk to Mark Raskin of IPS. He'd be a good one to talk to.
Oh, sure.
And so this was the first I knew of this. Neil had never, up till this day, had never told me anything about it. Well, of course, concealing his sources, and being private about the sources. But they had, in fact, given him all that I'd given them, which was about 1,000 pages of quite important stuff. And they'd done that in, I guess, late January of 1971. Now, I went to him, it's in the book, I think early March of 1971, after they'd suggested I go to Neil. And, why it was not coincidental that they suggested I go to Neil. That's what their calculations were is a complicated story. But that means to me, by the way, that the Times, someone at the Times knew about that story long before they've ever admitted, because Neil had to have discussed that with people high on the Times, who probably kept it very closely held.
Have you talked to Neil since 2002?
Yes, he won't. He won't talk much about that. He doesn't. He says, "I've told you all I can tell you," and so forth. In other words, the Times' involvement remains a very sensitive, internal secret of some sort. And of course, what I have to infer is that the Times has been lying steadily. Everybody on the Times, many of them probably didn't know the facts, but some did. And they've been, whoever it was who knew, has been dissimulating all this time about how they knew and who knew and what came up and so forth. Because, in other words, they must have made the decision to go ahead, as Mark Raskin was assured they had, long, even before I dealt with Neil, rather than much later. So anyway, that's another story.
What warning did you have that the papers would appear on the front page of the New York Times?
Well, as you know, I mean, we're going over material that's in my book. But
I know, but I want to do it on camera.
I'll just tell it. Again, for reasons that Neil just would not really be forthcoming. And Neil, by the way, all this time was very friendly to me, as far as I do, very, very friendly. And some of the reasons for not saying some things are ordinary journalistic practice. Not to tell me at the time, for instance, that he had it earlier from somebody else. Keeping them secret is normal journalistic kind of practice. But why he would keep that up for 35 years seemed a little odd. But in particular, it remains somewhat mysterious to me that he did not tell me from the time that he himself copied the papers, having said that he wouldn't. Copy the papers to which I gave him access. He had copied them. And then later he asked me if he could have physical possession of the copies, which I postponed giving him that. This is all getting complicated now. Let me try to say it in a simpler way. When I gave him access to the papers, in the apartment actually of Patricia's half-brother in Cambridge, I asked him not to copy them or to take them with him to the Times in dealing with them to get a decision, because I felt that as soon as there's a copy out, it's totally out of my control. Those copies will be copied by other people. There'll be copies around. And then I figured the Times will probably not agree to publish these in the end. They'll think about it and they'll shy away from it, just as Fulbright had, and McCloskey and Matthias, everybody had sort of had second thoughts about this. So I thought they won't do it in the end. And then the copies will be all over the place. And somebody will tell the FBI. And later events showed there was a good deal of realism to that concern. So I said, I'll take that chance at the point that you tell me that the Times is seriously interested in running this. They think they probably will. I don't ask for guarantees. They can change their mind at the last moment, obviously, about the thing. But I want to know that they really think they probably will. It's their current intent to do it. And then I'll take the chance of letting them have the copies. And if they change their mind afterwards, that's too bad. But before that, I don't want you to have copies out. Just discuss it. He said, well, to convince them to do it, I need more. I need more. And I said, I'm sorry, Neil. I'm very frustrating to him. I don't want you to give until I have more assurance. You're just going to have to try to convince them. In fact, it turns out that, so he said, well, can I read the, I said, you can read them, you can even take notes on them, see, as long as you don't Xerox them. So then I'll just trust you to do it. And so I gave him a key to the apartment where they were being held so he could read them and take notes. He immediately then arranged with the Times. He got some money for copying. He brought his wife down to help him. They checked into a motor hotel. And they immediately took all the papers out and got them copied for the Times, so that I couldn't back out entirely. Now, I never blamed him for doing this. In effect, it was the way, he didn't have to do that, but I felt it was pretty much what I'd done. This material must get out, and I want to be sure that it does, you know, and so he got a copy. That seemed to me, when I learned about it, good. Even I could even admire it as journalistic behavior, even though it did involve lying to me. But what I've never fully understood was why he never did tell me that the Times was working on it. And the reason why that's odd is that, not knowing that they were serious, I continued to try to get them out by other channels. So he was taking that risk, that I would succeed in getting it out. So it was after that that I talked to McCloskey, for example, and I gave him about 1,000 pages or so, or more. And I showed it to some other people. And actually, I showed some to Howard Zinn and to Noam Chomsky to get just for their interest and feedback on the thing. And I dealt with Matthias and so forth. So he was taking a real risk that by not telling me. Now, I think that he feared that if he told me that they were about to do it, that I would get real busy and try even harder to get it out through Congress. I'm just trying to rationalize what he was doing. And indeed, I might have done that unless he told me not to. But if he told me very seriously, Dan, you know, this won't happen unless the Times has a scoop, don't do it, and here's why it's better, and so forth, I would have obeyed that. I take it he didn't trust me, you know, to do that, and he thought I might try to get it out somewhere else. It was a misunderstanding somehow. Anyway, he didn't tell me. And so the first I knew that the Times was even... Oh, then he actually went further. He said the Times has put this on the back burner. They are not making a decision on it. But I want to... And they've given me another job to work on. But I would like just to keep myself current on it and do more reading on it. I'm working in New York. Is it all right if I actually take a copy, make a copy of it? And so I said, okay, what the hell. A month had gone by. These other animals weren't channeling out. I said, go ahead. And I'd always told him that when I give you the copy, as far as I'm concerned, it's out of my hands. I know I can't control whether it's done or it isn't done and so forth. You know, that's my okay to go ahead. And even though he hadn't told me yet, I changed my mind and I did let him have the copy. That was about in April. They were working night and day, meanwhile, of course, in the New York Hilton to put it out. So actually, this uncertainty on me persisted until the last day, because I had learned that Senator Gravel was going to do a filibuster against the draft, which was about to expire. And I thought, okay, this is the perfect material for him to use in his filibuster, and we'll get it out on the floor of the Senate. So I had had it in my apartment with the intent that I was, for the first time, that I was going to take it to Washington on Monday and deal with Gravel on the issue, hand it to him if he wanted it. I'd never allowed it in the apartment before, lest I be caught with it. So on Saturday, the 12th, I get a call from a guy in the Times. This all gets complicated, but to whom I'd also given part of the papers for his book on Tonkin Gulf. And he told me, almost crying, Dan, that material you gave me, you know, from the bigger study on Tonkin Gulf, he said, the Times has it, and they have the whole study. I said, oh, really? And of course, I'd given them the whole study at that point, but I hadn't been told if they were doing anything. He said, yes, they're bringing it out tomorrow. They're going to bring it out tomorrow. This place is locked up tighter than a drum. They're afraid the FBI is going to come in and and confiscate it or enjoin them. I'd never heard any word, I'd never thought of an injunction, though the Times was very worried about it. And so everybody, nobody can get in or out without a pass, and they're all. He said, "My book is ruined. The Times is going to scoop it tomorrow." His book was coming out in a month. I said, "Tony, maybe this will just give you more publicity for the book. It'll make more interest in the book." He said, "No." He was right, actually, as it turned out. It did kill his book, essentially, called The President's War by Anthony Austin, even though he was onto something that the Times didn't have. But the book didn't get much attention. So I said, "Well, that's very interesting, Tony. I'm sorry about your book and all." So I then put in a call to Neil. Neil was unavailable. And so now I had the Pentagon Papers in my apartment, and they were worried the FBI was going to come down. They hadn't mentioned to me that I should expect an FBI raid any minute. So I called my friend Howard Zinn and said, "Howard, can you store something for me tonight?" We were going to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in Harvard Square, the movie, that evening with Roz and Howard. And so we went over to his apartment. I took his house. I took the Pentagon Papers with me. I gave them to him to store. And then we went to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And that night I went into the Harvard Square station kiosk and got the first editions of the Pentagon Papers that were coming out.
Did you think you were going to go to jail?
Well, yeah. I'd always assumed that I would go to jail if they chose to prosecute. I knew there was a slight chance, I could figure there was a slight chance they might not choose to prosecute for political reasons. And in fact, Ehrlichman advised the president not to prosecute. Ehrlichman, the domestic counselor. Good advice. If he'd followed that, he would have stayed in office, essentially. Or, strictly speaking, he would have still been concerned what other stuff I was going to put out. The plumbers would have come in. But if I hadn't been on trial, Dean's revelations could have been kept secret. The only way they came out was that I was still on trial 10 days after Nixon learned of it, and he had to send it to Nixon, and it came out. If I hadn't been on trial, they could have sat on that information successfully. So Ehrlichman's advice was good. But I thought if they prosecute, which is 97% likely, I'm bound to be convicted. 7,000 pages of top secret documents. As my lawyer said to me later, it has a bad ring to it. And moreover, 7,000 pages, I'll go for life. I thought this won't be a year or two or 5 years. So I expected to go to jail.
For life?
For life. Well, life, 30 years. Not necessarily consecutive life terms. I was put on trial facing 12 felony counts. 11 were worth 10 years each, and the conspiracy count 5 years. So a 115-year possible sentence. Now with good behavior, I'd only serve a third of that, which would be 35 years. I'd be getting out this year. That's 35 years after 1973, which is when my trial ended. So I'd get out this year.
Did the FBI contact Lewis? The administration feared that the FBI wasn't working hard enough to prosecute you because of Lewis Marks.
Yes, my wife is here. As you can interview her on this. The story was all over that he feared the FBI wouldn't go after it. Liddy thought it wouldn't go after it because Lewis Marks was such a close buddy of J. Edgar Hoover. They never met. Did you know that? By the way?
No.
Lewis Marks never met J. Edgar Hoover. Now, he's a right-wing Republican, and he did admire J. Edgar Hoover. And so he did what he did for everybody he knew slightly. he would send J. Edgar Hoover boxes and boxes of Marx toys to give out as presents at Christmas. I got, when I was in Vietnam, he sent me, and I was engaged to his daughter, he sent me boxes that I could give out to embassy people and Vietnamese and whatnot. He must have sent thousands of boxes of these out to friends and associates. So he would send J. Edgar Hoover boxes of toys to give out, just as an admirer. And they knew people in common, he had friends in common, because of the right-wing circles that my father-in-law moved in. And he was on, I think, a list of friends of the FBI. So actually, when, I think his name was Brennan, an officer in charge of the investigation, listed people who should be interviewed with respect to me, they listed my father-in-law and stepmother-in-law, everybody. And they had a box next to each one, approved or not approved. And apparently, the story is, the tapes, rather the records seem to show, Hoover disapproved the interview of Marx on the grounds that he was a friend of the FBI. And Brennan apparently misread this mark and did assign someone to interview Marx, which didn't happen. It never came about. Now, Louis Marx would have been more than happy not just to be interviewed, but to put me in prison. He was a Nixon Republican. He thought I should be in prison, as he told my wife. And Patricia said, I don't want you to hear that anymore. You know, he's my husband, and so forth. Louis Marx never saw me again, would never see me again, after the Pentagon Papers came out. And his son, his oldest son, has never seen me again for 37 years now. And the father is dead now. But so he would have been happy to do it. When Hoover learned that Brennan had scheduled an interview against his will, he was furious and wanted to reassign Brennan to Siberia, or the equivalent of Siberia, somewhere. And he had to be prevailed on that this would not be good. Brennan was a very good guy, and he couldn't do this, and so forth. So that's what that was about. But in fact, there was no question of their not being interested in me. It was just specifically Louis Marx that Hoover was inclined not to have interviewed, mistakenly. And Hoover would have been, the stepmother was interviewed, by the way, the stepmother-in-law. Yeah. And she didn't mind being interviewed. None of these people minded. They were all interviewed, actually, except for Louis Marx. And he was envious. He wanted to be interviewed. But they did, of course. But remember, well, don't remember, the people I'm talking to don't know. The FBI knew who put out the Pentagon Papers because they had known it since early 1970. They had been told by now this is my former wife's mother-in-law, her father's wife, not her mother, second wife. The stepmother had told, I think I've got the wrong relationship here. It's mother-in-law.
Yeah. No, it's your mother-in-law.
All right.
Stepmother-in-law.
My stepmother-in-law.
Stepmother-in-law.
I'm very bad on these relationships. Her stepmother, correct? Her stepmother.
Your stepmother?
Her father's second wife is her stepmother.
Yes.
Fair? Okay.
Yes.
I do this all the time with relatives. I can't get it right. Okay. She had become quite conservative in her older age, and she went right to the FBI, having been told by my former wife that I had copied the Pentagon Papers. So the FBI knew this from either late 69 or early 70, and they interviewed Rand. Do you know about this, or
no.
Do not know? I think this was something I had to cut out of the book just for space. I had a whole chapter on it. The FBI came to Rand in April of 70, having already tried to interview my wife, former wife. And my former wife, had been advised by her lawyer not to see them unless with a lawyer. And they don't interview people with their lawyers, so they gave up on that. They came to Rand Harry Rowan and these security officers and various people to tell them this story that I had copied the Pentagon Papers, and apparently not then, of course, known as the Pentagon Papers, but that I'd copied a large top-secret study and given it to Fulbright and Goodell. And the president of RAND then told them, well, those people had a right to see it anyway. As senators, they could get it mistaken, because when Fulbright asked for the study on a classified basis 4 times of Secretary of Defense Laird, he was simply refused. He didn't get it. But even a well-informed Harry is not exactly a layman at that point. He'd been in the government. He was president of RAND. But he assumed that a senator did have a right to it. Indeed, the senators thought that. But, no. So he said, Harry actually said, it's not a security issue here, it's indiscretion. But at this point, knowing that it had gone to Fulbright and Goodell, the FBI, we know from their files now, which I got on Freedom of Information Act, backed off. They decided that since Fulbright was involved, it had the potential to, quote, embarrass the Bureau if they pursued this issue. It would come out, Fulbright might hurt them on their appropriations somehow, get into a fight with the senator from Arkansas. So they backed off on this in about May of 1970. Yes. A year before the Pentagon Papers. Well, when the Pentagon Papers came out, they knew who had given it very quickly. What is not clear from the files, I've gotten, I think 24,000 pages. Let's see. No, I've gotten 16,000 pages of files from the FBI. I've never gone through them, it's just too much. Yeah. FOI, a lot of it blacked out, of course. But from what I did read, it's not clear whether the FBI ever made clear to the White House that they had known about this a year earlier and hadn't moved on it. On the other hand, it's possible they did tell Henry Kissinger and others. There's some indications that Kissinger did know about it. This is all a bit somewhat murky.
Let me ask you, and that's my last question, which is your relationship with Henry Kissinger. He was initially madder than anyone else in the Oval Office.
Oh, no, that's the history of that is belied by the tapes very strongly. In fact, I'm surprised to hear you say that.
Well,
actually. Haven't you seen in my book, the very first discussion on June 13th between him and Nixon?
I'm sure I have. Wasn't he? But wasn't he upset? What was he thinking about you?
A very, very mild reaction. The idea of someone putting out tapes was very ominous as a precedent for others, because they had a lot of secrets that had to be kept secret from the public and from Congress. The question it was a question, though, of whether the person had access. There's a lot of discussion between Nixon and Kissinger. What does State have? What does Laird have? Rogers and Laird were both skeptics of their policy. And Kissinger assures them, I haven't given State or Defense real data on what our plans are, what we are. Don't worry about it. All they know is what we've done. This is almost an exact quote, not why we've done it or what our motives were or something. I don't tell them that, the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. We go back to what I was talking about compartmentation earlier. They have no need to know. They're critical of the policy. They would object to it. They might even leak. In fact, one of the first suspicions by Nixon and Kissinger was that Laird had leaked the Pentagon
sure were they.
papers. What?
Yes, this was a long concern of
Yeah. So that's why they didn't give him that kind of information. In other words, so long as I didn't know much, as far as Nixon knew, about his policy, Nixon had no reason to fear me. I'm at Rand. Now, Kissinger knew I knew a little more that he let on. As far as I can tell from the record, or memoirs or anything, Kissinger never did, from the tapes, Kissinger never did reveal to Nixon that I'd worked for him on NISM 1 or on the options paper, or at all for the Pierre or the early. The indication of that is he talks about my dealing with him in the late 60s, my having dealt with him. Yeah. And then again, a meeting that he had with me in 71, he tells, at a conference where I confronted him, an MIT conference where I confronted him. He doesn't mention in that very conversation that I had worked in his office in early 1969, or that I had had 2 long discussions with him at San Clemente in 1970. I infer from these omissions, this strange history which goes up to this point and then breaks off and then picks up here, that he didn't want to admit to Nixon that the man who had just released the Pentagon Papers had worked directly for him in the Nixon administration. In this. See.
Which is why Nixon assumed there had to be a conspiracy.
There had to be a conspiracy, that I must have gotten it from somebody else. Now, if they had had a discussion of the fact that I'd worked on NISM 1, a frank discussion, they both would have discussed, well, probably that's all he has. And, there would be, it would not follow. But as far as that somebody else had to give it to me. But when they realized that I had documents on NISM 1, that is from the Nixon NSC, Nixon had to assume that I'd gotten it from somebody else. Kissinger didn't have to assume that.
To see the first part of this